Morning, everybody. Well, if we haven't met yet, my name is Doug. I am one of the pastors here. And this week I told my wife that I want a Tacozilla. Anybody know what a Tacozilla is? Oh, good. Okay, well, then I get to tell you and show you what a Tacozilla is. So this week I told my wife, I said, "Hun, I want a Tacozilla." She said, "What in the world is a Tacozilla?" I said, "Well, a Tacozilla it's a modified Toyota Tacoma truck. It's built for overlanding and camping, and it looks like this." And I showed her this picture. Isn't she beautiful? So I drive a 2004 Ford Explorer right now. I was at a men's retreat this last weekend. I folded down the seats. I slept in the back. It worked. But I saw this, and I said, I got to have one. Like, I need to have one of them now. Now, her reaction was a little bit different. She looked at that. Again, I look at it, I think, oh my gosh, it's beautiful. She looked at that, thought it was hideous. She said, "Would you really expect me to drive around with you in that?" I said, "Drive around with me, hon. I want to live in it." Apparently, based on her reaction, if I do choose to live in it, I'll be living in it alone. But anyway, that's a Tacozilla. So this morning, we're going to talk about money. But before you get nervous about that, really what we're going to be talking about isn't even really money. We're really going to be talking about trust. Because this week, I've been wrestling with a quote from a pastor named Craig Rochelle. And Pastor Craig Rochelle said these words. I'll read them to you and let you wrestle with them. "What you fear the most reveals what you value the most, and where you fear or where you trust God the least." What you fear, what you get worried about, concerned about, anxious about, shows us. It's a signal that reveals what we value the most and where we trust God the least. Ouch. Now, I don't know about you, but I've been watching people over the last year or so, and I've been watching so many people, including a lot of Christians, so many people who are experiencing, you and I probably included in this, experiencing so much fear and anxiety because of money. The fear of not having enough money. Many of us know that fear of being gripped with, there's no way I'm going to be able to pay what needs to be paid this month, and it just hangs over us. The fear of losing the money that we do have, right? That's why we put it in banks and we keep it safe, and some of us, buy firearms so that we can protect what's ours, right? Because there's this fear of losing the money that we do have, the fear of economic policies and legislation that might cost us more of our money, right? We're watching the news, we're reading legislation, we're going, why did he do that? Why did they sign that into the law? Why did they decide that? That's going to cost me some of my money. The fear that someone else might take my money from me. The fear that the government is going to take more of my money from me. The fear that of having to spend all of our money just to put gas in our cars right now, right? These are real fears. I'm not alone in experiencing fear and anxiety and worry over some of these things. I mean, just listen to some of the recent headlines. I'll put them on the screen for you. These are recent. "The next financial crisis is coming," Newsweek says. "Wall Street's fear gauge hits highest levels since June," says CNBC. The bad inflation news continues to get worse," says the Wall Street Journal. "Volatility in currency markets crystallizes fear of a global recession. Stock market losses wipe out $9 trillion of Americans' wealth." Some of you are like, yes, I had some dollars in that. "Gas prices spike yet again and approach a new record in California and Los Angeles," says KTLA. No wonder we feel nervous and anxious and worried about money. I mean, these are real things. This isn't just fear-mongering among the news outlets, although that probably contributes to it. But these are real things, and you and I are experiencing those things daily. And so even though our money, it's printed on here, even though our money says, "In God we trust," all of this fear, all of this anxiety, all of this worry that you and I experience because of our money should cause us to stop and ask ourselves this question: in which God do I really trust? In which God am I really putting my trust? Because see, what you and I fear the most reveals what we value the most and reveals where we trust God the least. So this morning, we're going to start by reading some words that Jesus said about money. Not because Jesus said that money is evil or bad fundamentally, but because Jesus tells us that there is a fundamental conflict between God and money anytime we trust it, serve it, or worship it. And then after we read what Jesus has to say about money, we're going to look at 3 stories in the New Testament where people did just that. They trusted money. They served money. They worshiped money. And then at the end of our time together, we're going to receive communion. We're going to take communion together as a way to recenter our hearts and our priorities and our trust around Jesus Christ, our King. So, if you have your Bibles or a Bible app, I'm going to invite you to turn to Matthew chapter 6. Matthew chapter 6. We're actually going to read a passage that we've read lots of times around here. In fact, just a few months ago, we read it and studied it. And so you're going to go, oh my gosh, I know this one. Okay, the Bible isn't like math, where once you've figured out addition, you kind of got it, right? The Bible, we can continue to plumb the depth. There's more to see. There's more to understand. There's more to apply, right? We're growing. The Word of God constantly speaking to us. So we're going to look at Matthew chapter 6, a passage that we've read before. We're going to start in verse 19, and we're going to read some words that Jesus had to say about money. And then again, in the middle of the message, we're going to look at 3 other passages that are going to unpack this a little bit to us. So Matthew chapter 6, starting in verse 19, we read the words of Jesus, who says this. He says, "Do not store up for yourselves treasures on earth." In other words, temporary stuff, where moths and vermin destroy, where thieves and the government can steal it. But store up for yourself. I just threw that in there. Don't think that that's actually in the Bible. Okay, that's just me, because I know that's how some of us feel sometimes. Continuing on, verse 20. But he says, instead of that, don't do that. Don't store up temporary stuff. He says, instead, store up for yourselves treasures in heaven. In other words, invest in eternal things where moth and vermin can't destroy it, where thieves don't break in and steal. For where your treasure is, and we know this, many of us have heard this before, that's where your heart is going to be also. In verse 22, and let me just preemptively say this, Jesus is going to use kind of a metaphor, some figurative language to describe generosity and greed. And he uses this idea of a healthy eye or an unhealthy eye. And it was just a euphemism for describing generosity or stinginess. So he says this, he says, if the eye is the lamp of the body, and if your eyes are healthy, in other words, if you're generous, your whole body will be full of light. But if your eyes are unhealthy, in other words, you're always looking around at what everybody else has and you're jealous and you wish you had what they had, well, then your whole body will be full of darkness. And if then the light within you is darkness, well, how great is that darkness? And then he says in verse 24, and we'll close with this verse, no one can serve 2 masters. He says it's one or the other. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot, Jesus says, serve both God and money. Let's stop there. This is the word of the Lord for us this morning. Jesus is saying 3 things. And many of us are very familiar with this passage. Some of us have read it dozens, even hundreds of times. Some of us, it might be brand new. What is Jesus saying here? He's saying 3 primary things. One, he's saying invest in eternal things, not just temporary things. And listen, this goes for all of us, regardless of our age, regardless of how much money we have, regardless of whether you're still in school and you got no money at all, whatever. Invest in eternal things, your time, your energy, your resources, your money. Put that towards things that are going to last, transform lives. Invest in eternal things, not just the temporary stuff of now and today and here. The second thing that he's saying be generous and not selfish. That's verses 22 and 23 when he's talking about the eye is healthy or your eye is unhealthy. He's talking about generosity versus selfishness. And Jesus is making it really clear. No, be generous. Just have a generous heart, a generous attitude. If there's a need that you can meet, perhaps that's a need you should meet. He's saying be generous, not selfish. And then in verse 24, he boils it down and says, listen, you can't serve both God and money. In other words, one of those 2 will always be more important than the other, but you and I get to choose which is which. Okay, so with those words of Jesus in our minds, okay, so just with that picture in your mind of what Jesus just said there about money, I want to show you 3 examples from the New Testament of people who didn't get it. People who were more concerned about temporary things than eternal things, people who were more selfish than they were generous, and people who certainly served money over God. They didn't get it. They didn't get this, and we're going to look at 3 stories. So the first is going to be in Mark chapter 5. So again, if you have a Bible or Bible app and you want to go ahead and turn there, we're going to look at a story in Mark chapter 5. And it's a really interesting story on its own, but I think it illustrates a point that I want to make this morning. Now, we're going to read verses 1 through 17. So we're actually going to read quite a bit of scripture this morning, but this one is a really interesting sort of narrative. So it says Jesus and his disciples, and they're traveling to a place called the Gerasenes. And it's this kind of region. There's a few different towns that kind of make up this area. And so it says this, Mark chapter 5, verses 1 through 17. We're going to see some people that didn't quite get this truth about money. They, the disciples, went across the lake to the region of the Gerasenes. When Jesus got out of the boat, a man with an impure spirit came from the tombs. Okay, he's living in the graveyards to meet him. This man lived in the tombs, lived in the graveyard, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain. He'd often been chained hand and foot, but he tore the chains apart and broke the irons in his feet. No one was strong enough to subdue him. So this is like the UFC champ of the Gerasenes, right? But he's living a tragic life because in verse 5 we read this, night and day among the tombs and in the hills he would cry out and cut himself with stones. So this guy is just tormented on the inside. Verse 6, when he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and he fell on his knees in front of him. He shouted at the top of his voice, but this is sort of like the demonic oppression kind of shouting out of him. What do you want from me, Jesus, Son of the Most High? In God's name, don't torture me. And this is a bizarre scene. Because Jesus, in verse 8, Jesus had said to him, come out of this man, you impure spirit. Then Jesus asked the man, what is your name? This is a creepy moment from a horror movie. My name is Legion, this guy replied, for we are many. And then he begged Jesus again and again not to send them out of the area. So again, the sort of demonic spirits that were inside this guy are like talking to Jesus and saying, come on, just let us stay here. Let us hang out in this guy. Let us stay in this area. Don't send us away. I mean, it's a bizarre, really strange, probably scary scene, particularly for the disciples and the people that were kind of watching this all unfold. This is where it continues to get interesting. Verse 11. A large herd of pigs was feeding on the nearby hillside. The demons begged Jesus, listen to this, send us into the pigs. Allow us to go into them. And Jesus, strangely, gave them permission, and the impure spirits came out of the man and went into the pigs. The herd, about 2,000 in number, rushed down the steep bank into the lake and were drowned. Verse 14, those tending the pigs ran off and reported this in the town and the countryside. Yeah, I bet. And then the people went out to see what happened. Wait, what? What happened? We got to go see this thing for ourselves. Verse 15, when they came to Jesus, they saw the man who had previously been possessed by the legion of demons, but now he's sitting there. He's dressed, he's in his right mind, and the people were afraid. They didn't know what to do with this. Verse 16, those who had seen it told the people what had happened to the demon-possessed man and told them about the pigs as well. Then the people began to plead with Jesus to leave their region. Now, I've read this story dozens of times. Maybe you have too. Maybe this is the first time you've read it. I mean, it's a strange story, right? Why did Jesus and the pigs and they ran into all sorts of stuff to explore there. But one of the things that I could never quite understand is why the people freaked out and asked Jesus to leave their town. I would read verse 15 that describes this man sitting in his right mind and fully dressed. And I'm like, why did seeing this man dressed and in his right mind scare them? Why did it freak them out? Why did it cause them to beg Jesus to leave their area? But this week when I read the story, I realized something. And maybe you've realized this when you've read this story before. The reason the people begged Jesus to leave their region wasn't just because he healed a demon-possessed man, and that was a strange thing for them to witness. It was because Jesus had disrupted their local economy. They were upset because they had lost money. If you look closely at verse 16, you'll see that it wasn't until the people found out about the 2,000 pigs who had been lost due to drowning that they began to ask Jesus to leave. Because, see, the pigs represented money. And losing the pigs meant that they had lost money. And I don't know if you know this, but losing money makes people very upset. You've seen this. You've experienced this. Losing money makes people anxious. Losing money makes people scared. Why? Because what we fear most reveals what we value the most and where we trust God the least. And so in this story is a group of people that saw their chances of making money from these pigs lost and got very upset and asked Jesus, begged Jesus, pleaded with Jesus to please go away and leave. We don't like the impact you're having on our economy. Next story, Acts chapter 16. So we'll flip the pages over a few books, and we're going to go to Acts chapter 16. And in Acts chapter 16, Paul and Silas are in a town called Philippi. And they're going around and they're doing ministry. They're praying with people. They led this woman, Lydia, who was a wealthy, very wealthy person, led her to the Lord. Paul and Silas did not say, now that you are a follower of Jesus, you need to give away all of your possessions. No, she actually leveraged her wealth and her possessions in ways that advanced the kingdom. But later, in verse 16, so this is Acts chapter 16, verse 16, we pick up the story, and Paul and Silas are on their way to a place of prayer. Let me read you what it says. Once, when we were going to the place of prayer, we were met by a female slave who had a spirit by which she predicted the future. So she has some sort of demonic spirit that allows her to prophesy or predict the future. She earned a great deal of money for her owners through this fortune telling. She followed Paul and the rest of us shouting, "These men are servants of the Most High who are telling you the way to be saved." She kept this up for many days. Finally, this is so strange to me. Finally, Paul became so annoyed that he turned around and said to the spirit, "In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to come out of her." At that moment, the spirit left her, which always leaves me thinking, why did Paul wait all these days until he's finally just had enough? Okay, that's it. You've been following me around for days. Come out of her. Why did he wait? I don't know. I don't know that we have an answer. But he gets so irritated that he says, that's it. Come out of her. He commands the spirit to leave this girl, and the spirit does. Look at verse 19, though. When her owners realized that their hope of making money was gone. That makes people upset. They seized Paul and Silas. They dragged them into the marketplace to face the authorities. They brought them out before the magistrates and said, "These men are Jews, and they're throwing our city into an uproar by advocating customs unlawful for us Romans to accept or practice." You mean casting a demon out of a slave girl? Okay. Verse 22, the crowd joined in the attack against Paul and Silas, and the magistrates ordered them to be stripped and beaten with rods. After they had been severely flogged, they were thrown into prison, and the jailer was commanded to guard them carefully. When he received these orders, he put them in the inner cell and fastened their feet in the stocks. Let me stop there. Just so you know what happens, what ends up happening in the story, this is the moment, some of you know the story, where Paul and Silas are in the inner sanctum of the deepest, darkest dungeon. They're chained to the wall, and they begin to sing songs of praise. Remember, their backs are filleted open by this being beaten with rods. They're chained to the wall. They begin to sing praises to God, and an earthquake occurs, loosens their chains. They're able to get up, and instead of escaping, they stay. The jailer comes in thinking that they've all escaped. They haven't escaped, and he falls to his knees and accepts Christ, and his whole family ends up getting baptized. That's what ends up happening. But in this story, it's so interesting because we have to ask ourselves, so why was it that Paul and Silas got dragged in front of the authorities? Why was it that they got beaten with rods? Why did they get thrown into the deepest, darkest dungeon in Philippi? What was it that they had done that was so wrong? And it wasn't just because they had cast a demon out of a slave girl. It was because they caused her owners to lose money. And once again, losing money makes people really upset, really angry, really nervous, really anxious, really scared. Because what we fear the most reveals what we trust the most, and reveals or what we value the most, and reveals where we trust God the least. Okay, one more story. One more story, Acts chapter 19. We'll flip the page, just maybe one page. We'll go to Acts chapter 19. Paul is now in a town called Ephesus. And there's a lot going on in Ephesus. I mean, people are coming to put their trust in Jesus. People are getting baptized. The sick are being healed. People are repenting from sorcery and witchcraft. It says that they brought all these scrolls, these like witchcraft and scrolls, and they burned them because they're like, we don't want that anymore. Like, we want to follow Jesus. And there's this radical transformation happening. The name of Jesus, the scriptures say, was being held in high honor. So it's like, I mean, the message of Jesus is going out, seeing transformation. And we pick it up in verse 23. Acts chapter 19, verse 23. Lots of ministry happening, lots of life transformation. And about that time, there arose such a great disturbance about the way. Now, that phrase, the way, just means the Christian faith. This was sort of, people were saying, oh yeah, we're following Jesus. We're part of the way. It was kind of one of the titles that was used to describe Christianity at the time. Verse 24, a silversmith named Demetrius, who made silver shrines, or little like idols of Artemis, which was a goddess, the goddess of the hunt, the Greek goddess of the hunt, brought in a lot of business for the craftsmen there. And he, Demetrius, called them all together along with the workers in the related trades, and he said, listen, guys, I mean, you know that we receive a good income from this business. And they're like, yeah, we do. We make a lot of money, yeah. Verse 26, and you hear how this fellow Paul has convinced and led astray a large number of people here in Ephesus and practically the whole province of Asia. They're not following Artemis anymore. They're following Jesus because Paul says that gods made by human hands are no gods at all. Duh. Verse 27. So there is this danger. Demetrius is stirring them up. This workers' union's getting, rallied up, right? Verse 27. He says there's a danger that not only our trade will lose its good name, but the temple of the great goddess Artemis will be discredited. And the goddess herself, who is worshipped throughout the province of Asia and the world, will be robbed of her divine majesty. What a weak God, right? They're like, your God needs you to make little shrines. Otherwise, okay, whatever. We won't even get into that. But when they heard this, when this group of craftsmen and silversmiths and tradesmen, when they heard this, they were furious. They're like, you know what, you're right. And they began shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians. And soon the whole city was in an uproar. Let's stop there. They ended up grabbing Paul's companions and dragging them towards the theater. You can still see the archaeological remains of this theater in Ephesus. They dragged them to the theater to appear before the authorities, similar to what had happened in Philippi. They're hoping to convince the authorities in town to get rid of these guys because they're talking about Jesus. And by talking about Jesus, they're causing people to begin to follow Jesus. And because they're following Jesus, they're no longer interested in Artemis. And because they're no longer interested in the goddess Artemis, we're losing money because we stand to profit when people come to the city of Ephesus and worship in the temple. We sell trinkets, we sell shrines, we sell idols, and if people turn to Jesus, we're going to lose money. So why was the whole city in an uproar? Why did Demetrius the silversmith incite a riot against Paul and his companions? Why did the crowd drag them to the theater and shout, great is Artemis, for 2 hours? If you keep reading, it says that they just kept shouting for 2 hours. It says that a crowd gathered around and was shouting too, but they didn't even know why they were there. They were just like caught up in this mob mentality. So they're all just shouting for 2 hours straight. Why? It wasn't just devotion to their goddess. It wasn't just a conflict between two religious ideologies. The spread of Christianity in Ephesus was causing a drop in sales for Demetrius and for his fellow silversmiths and craftsmen. And they were losing money. And what did we say about losing money? People don't like it when they lose money. Makes people angry. Makes people nervous, makes people worried, makes people anxious, makes people scared. And as I was reading these stories this week and thinking about maybe putting these together in this message and sharing this, it forced me to ask myself this question. how would I have responded if I was one of the people in these stories? Like, how would I have responded if I was the owner of the pigs and this had happened to my opportunity to gain financially? This was my business. I built this business. I'd invested in this business. My family had helped build this business. Finally, we had a sizable number of pigs. We had a large herd. How would I have responded? How would I have responded if I was one of the slave owners in Philippi and my chance of making money disappeared because Jesus healed our moneymaker? How would I have responded if I was Demetrius or one of the silversmiths and I was seeing sales dropping and my business was tanking? Now, I think when we read this, we would all like to think to ourselves that if we were the owners of the pigs, we would be more excited about this poor guy that had been healed than we were about our 2,000 pigs. I mean, we'd love to think that if we were the slave owners, we'd realize, wow, a transformed life is more important than me making money. I mean, we'd like to think that if we were the Demetrius and the silversmiths, we'd be so excited about lives getting transformed and people getting healed that we would say, you know what, it's worth it. Our business is tanking, we might lose it, but you know what, it's worth it. We'd like to think that that's how we would respond if we were in those situations. But perhaps we should ask ourselves these questions. Well, how do I respond now when I don't have enough money? How do I respond now when something causes me to lose money? How do I respond now when I feel like my money might be threatened? Because how I respond now is probably a pretty good indicator of how I would have responded then if I was in those situations. So then we have to ask ourselves the question that we started with. What do my fears about money in our current climate reveal about what I truly value? What does it reveal about where I struggle with trusting God? For those of you that are younger and you're thinking about eventual college or career or workplace, when you think about what you want to make sure that you make or earn and have, what does that say about what you truly value? What does that say about where you struggle with trusting God? And the real challenge for you and me as followers of Jesus isn't just about trusting money less. It's about trusting God more. That's what I want to emphasize this morning. It's about recentering our lives. Like our whole lives, every priority, everything we think about, everything we do, every decision we make, it's about prioritizing our entire lives on Jesus Christ and prioritizing everything else around Him as the highest priority. So what we're going to do this morning is we're going to receive communion. Communion is just a good opportunity to sort of hit pause, be quiet for a few minutes, to reflect, think about maybe some of what I just shared. Think about priorities, prioritization. Think about Christ as the centerpiece of our lives. So just before we receive communion together, I want to say two things as your pastor. And then Josh and the team are going to lead a song while we prepare our hearts for communion. The first thing is this. There are probably many of us here today and joining us online who are facing some pretty significant financial challenges. I don't deny that at all. So it's really easy for pastor to get up on stage and talk about money and talk about money. It's like, yeah, I'd love to talk about money too, but I don't have any. Or I certainly don't have anywhere even near enough. You talk about being generous. I've got to figure out how to stay in my apartment this month. So I get that. Trust me, I get that. So there's some of us here today that are facing some pretty significant financial challenges. In debt, the loss of income, living paycheck to paycheck, but barely making it, not sure if you're going to be able to sort of make it to the end. So if you're here and you feel like you could use some help with your financial situation, listen, we want to help. I don't want to just get up here and preach about stuff and then send you out to kind of figure it out yourself. We actually want to help, practically help. And so as Marcy mentioned earlier, our stewardship education team is offering a personal and family finance class on Monday, October 10th. Not tomorrow, but the next Monday. Love to invite you to participate. There's lots of people there, plenty of people there. And this isn't a class designed to like pile on more guilt and shame. Why aren't you doing this? You should have been doing this. How did you end up in this situation? That's not it at all. You're gonna be in a room full of people who are like, yeah. I need to fix some stuff, figure some stuff out, get some stuff right. It's designed to help you take practical steps towards solving your financial challenges. So on your way out today, or if you're joining us online, either go to our website, venturamissionary.com, or if you're here, stop off and pick up a flyer. It looks like this. Pick one of these up. And for you or for someone else, pick one of these up and get signed up. The second thing is this. And I got to be careful with this because I get it. If you're maybe a little bit jaded about church or Christianity and you kind of feel like, man, the church just wants my money. That's all this is all about. It's just the church trying to get... That's not it at all. I promise you. If you know me, you know that that's not the case. If you don't know me, I'm just going to ask you to trust me. That is not the case. But I do want to say this. If you consider yourself to be a part of Ventura Missionary Church, part of the Ventura Missionary Church family, you get to decide whether you include yourself in that. It's not up to me. It's up to you saying, yeah, like this is my church home. This is my church family. If that's true, I want to encourage you to be giving consistently, joyfully, and sacrificially towards the mission of the church. Because we started with Matthew chapter 6. Don't store up treasures on earth where you can kind of lose it and it can get taken. And no. Invest in eternal things. Well, when you give to a missionary, when you give to a church, when you give to the mission of what the church is about, transformation of lives, life transformation is what you're giving towards. It doesn't get much more eternal than that. Those are heavenly things. So I want to encourage you. Now, there's lots of us in this room and online that are already doing that, and I want to acknowledge that. But if you consider yourself to be a part of Intermissionary Church and you're not giving regularly to the ministry of the church, I want to encourage you to do so. Now, if you're visiting this morning, you're kind of checking Ventura Missionary Church out, please don't think to yourself, I knew it. Talk about money. I knew the pastor's going to ask me. Listen, we don't want your money. In fact, if you're visiting or you're just kind of checking this place out, I promise you we don't want your money. In fact, don't leave any money in the offering on your way out. I would encourage you not to do that because that's not really the goal. But for those of us who consider this place to be home, this is my church home, this is my church family, let's continue to give consistently, joyfully, and sacrificially to the work that God has called us to together as the church. So here's what we're going to do this morning. Josh and the team are going to play a song. We just begin to prepare our hearts to receive communion. And if you are here and you didn't happen to pick up the elements on your way in, you don't have the bread and the juice, then once I step off the stage, just slip your hand up. You can stay seated. Everyone can stay seated. Just slip your hand up, and some of our ushers will bring around the communion elements to you if you didn't get them on the way in. But I'm just going to invite you to have those elements in your hand. As Josh and the team lead this song, just pause for a moment, and this is an opportunity to begin to prepare our hearts to receive communion together. And then I'll come back up and lead us through receiving the elements together in just a moment.